Hello. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Vivianne Crowley. I'm a writer, a psychologist, an academic, and a Wiccan priestess. And today my talk is called From Wicca to Wild Once, Pagan Spirituality Today. And what I'll be talking about are some of the things that to me are important about contemporary paganism, and to reflect on where we've been and where we might be going. And first of all, I wanted to thank the Scottish Pagan Federation for this opportunity to participate in this conference, which is a belated celebration of the 50th golden anniversary of the Pagan Federation itself, but it's also the 30th anniversary of the first Scottish Pagan Federation conference. And many of you who are listening will know that my husband Chris and I have had a long involvement with the Pagan Federation in Scotland. We first met long-term Pagan Federation members Jean and Jim Fowler in the summer of 1991. And at that time, Chris was treasurer of the Pagan Federation. It was before he became president. I was secretary. Prudence Jones was the president. And together with the other committee members, we were working hard to expand the Pagan Federation's membership and activities across Britain. And this included creating a network of coordinators for the different nations and regions. And Jean and Jim knew two of the Pagan Federation's founders, John and Jean Score, and so they were two of the earliest members of the Pagan Federation. They joined before Chris and I. So naturally, when it came to Scotland, we asked them if they would become the organisers for Scotland. And fortunately, they agreed, and then they quite quickly arranged to hold the first Scottish Pagan Federation conference, and that was at the University of Edinburgh on Saturday, the 13th of June, 1992. And Chris and I had the great pleasure of attending. I gave a presentation, and those of you who were there in 1992 may remember that it was a wonderful day. It was the first time that anything like this had happened in Scotland. For many pagans there, it was their first experience of a large gathering with others of like mind. So it was exciting and joyful. And for Chris and I, it was the opportunity to make new long-term friends, including John and Kitty McIntyre, who will be known to many of you. So it's with great pleasure, 30 years on, that I'm speaking at this celebration of 50 years of the Pagan Federation in the UK. And I'm only sorry that we can't all be together in one place in person. But since those small beginnings of the Pagan Federation 50 years ago, paganism in Scotland has developed in leaps and bounds, as most of you will know. And in the UK, Scotland has led the way in achieving recognition for paganism as a religion, taking its place amongst other faith traditions in Scotland as an equal partner. And we have come a long way. Steffi von Scott has written something on the Scottish Pagan Federation's website about how when the PF began 50 years ago, you could lose your job. You could have your children taken away by social services. You might get a brick thrown through your window or be forced even to leave your home just for being a pagan. And now in Scotland, obviously you have legal marriage celebrants. I noticed Steffi wrote that more legal pagan weddings take place in Scotland than weddings by the Mormons or the Jewish faith communities. And you have pagan university chaplains like Jean and others. You've managed to get literature into the health service so that people who are treating pagan patients can find out what paganism is about. The list of achievements goes on. And one very important achievement, of course, and it's one where England and Wales have not yet been successful, is in getting a tick box for pagan on the optional religion question in the census. So a lot has changed since I spoke at that conference in 1992. And the other thing that has changed, of course, is the Pagan Federation's membership. So in the first few decades of the Pagan Federation, most of its members were practicing some form of pagan witchcraft or Wicca. And the talk I gave in Edinburgh in 1992 reflected that. So that first conference took place 3 years after the publication of my first book on paganism. This is the back of it with the iconic image of Stonehenge, which some of you may remember. So some of you may have a battered copy of this book still on your bookshelf somewhere. And when I published that book in '89, it turned out to be highly influential. I was writing it in the late 1980s. There were already excellent books about contemporary pagan witchcraft on the market, written, for example, by Doreen Valiente and by Stuart and Janet Farrar. And when I wrote the book, I'd been running a coven for about 10 years, and I'd done a first degree in psychology, followed by a doctorate, and I was trained in transpersonal therapy. So I was in the process of making an academic and therapy career, and I actually had no thoughts whatsoever about becoming a public Wiccan. And then one morning something happened. I was writing an article for a management magazine about psychological stress in the workplace. And this was even before I bought my first computer. I actually bought my first computer to write the book Wicca. So I was typing away on an electric typewriter, and then suddenly I looked at what was appearing on the paper, and I saw that actually I wasn't writing a management psychology article at all. And what was happening was that I was experiencing something that those of you who are artists or musicians or writers may have experienced too. It's what Andre Breton in his Surrealist Manifesto called automatism. So basically the brain switches off into a different mode, consciousness kind of dies away, and then a shift takes place. And one just does something straight from the unconscious. So what I found I was doing was that instead of writing the management article, and very boring that probably would have been, something else took over, and my brain was kind of channeling through my fingers onto the keyboard. And at the end of it, I found I'd written a 3-page synopsis for a book about Wicca. And I sort of read the synopsis, and at that point, my conscious mind was kind of catching up rather with what my unconscious was doing. And I sort of realized I had a feeling that although there are all these very good books about Wicca that could tell people what it was and how to practice it, there was an opportunity to build on that and go further. And I felt what I could possibly do, because of my background, was to write a book not about what to do, but more about why we do it and on the profound effect that it can have upon those who practice it, and also why we find meaning in these archaic seeming rituals. So to cut a long story short, I sent off this synopsis to Aquarian Press, and I was quite shocked when a letter came back fairly quickly afterwards saying, oh, we're interested in this. And that was followed soon after by an offer, and then a contract and a check for the advance. So I had to write it. So I had my 3-page synopsis. Now I had to produce the book. But it turned out that the reason why the publishers responded so promptly is that what my intuition had led me to do was to kind of hit upon what we might call the kairos, the critical moment, when actually the publishers were looking for a book just like that. So they felt the time was ripe. They wanted the book as soon as possible. And the reason they wanted it was because the appeal of Wicca and of other paganisms was growing. So whereas Wicca and paganism had been the interests of a very small minority, lots of things were happening in wider society that made these practices and these type of spiritualities much more attractive, particularly feminism and environmentalism. And what was happening then, and what has continued to happen, is that more and more people were turning away from organized religion, and they were looking for a spirituality that matched their values. So the idea of an earth-based spiritual tradition that honors the divine feminine, the natural cycle of seasonal change, that honors the energy of our planet, had tremendous resonance. And indeed, well, what's not to like, really? So when the actual finished book drew on my experience of Wicca, but also on my experience as a psychologist, and in particular, the psychological theories of Carl Gustav Jung. And Carl Jung's work made me appreciate Wicca in a new way. So yes, Wicca is a nature-based spirituality, a spirituality that also practices natural magic. But above that, in the initiatory traditions, that initiatory system has embedded within it powerful symbolic ritual processes. And these symbol systems, these rituals, they can expose us to what are really archetypal transformatory experiences that can cause shifts in consciousness. And part of that shift is to align our everyday self, the everyday ego, with the deeper self, our divine center, that is in turn in connection with the gods. And I think it was that aspect of it and the references to and the links to Carl Jung's work that enabled lots of people outside of Wicca to understand its appeal in a way that they hadn't done before. And this meant the book was taken seriously by the mainstream media. This was kick-started by The Guardian, which ran a full-length feature by journalist Hilary Doling. It's got a famous picture that was taken on a local sacred site in front of a tree, and it looks like I have a tree growing out of my head, so, which is fine. It's a kind of pagan image, but it's the tree growing out of her head article, is that one. But that article was picked up by other mainstream press, BBC Radio, etc. And that publicity and what I was talking about in interviews resonated with people who would never otherwise have bought a book about Wicca or pagan witchcraft, and who hadn't before thought of themselves as being pagan or Wiccan, but they identified with the spiritual experiences I was talking about and with a pagan worldview. And one of the things the publishers had spoken to me about was that at the end of the book, I put in a contact address, not our home address, but a post box. But they were very anti this. They said, did I realize how many people would write in and I would have to respond to all these letters? And they advised me basically not to do it. But I said I did want to do it because I wanted the book to be able to point people in the direction of connecting with groups and organizations in the pagan community if people wanted to know more. So I collected up lots of networking addresses, and also obviously the Pagan Federation's address was available. And thousands of people did write in from all over the world, and I encouraged them wherever possible to become Pagan Federation members, which many did. So my role in the Pagan Federation evolved. As well as being secretary, I became the international coordinator. And eventually that international work built up so much that somebody else took that on. And then eventually that became its own organisation, Pagan Federation International, in much the same way as the Scottish Pagan Federation has become its own organisation. And Morgana, whom many of you will know and who's attended many Scottish Pagan Federation conferences, has worked heroically over decades to develop the Pagan Federation in so many countries over the past decades. So there was a kind of huge kind of Wiccan base within the Pagan Federation, but in those same years, other parts of the pagan community were also growing. So over the years, Pagan Federation members have become much more diverse, and now our communities encompass everyone from people who don't see their paganism as a religion at all. They see it much more as a way of life or as a philosophy, through to animists who seek connection with nature spirits, but maybe view this more as a spirituality and don't really like the label religion. And then we have people who do feel comfortable with the word religion and who venerate deities and who might label themselves Wiccans or Druids or heathens or goddess worshippers or whatever. So a very wide umbrella. And I think as time goes on and more people have abandoned the idea of organized religion, there is a huge hunger for other, more individualized forms of spirituality. And much of that is a longing, I think, for reconnection with nature. So what we're seeing is more and more people wanting to go out camping, wanting to spend time walking in nature, but also there can be a spiritual element to that. So more and more people than ever are going to visit sacred sites. People are practicing meditation, mindful walking. People are very drawn towards pagan music, and people are interested in seasonal festivals and in green festivals and in those festivals that are occupying that space between something that's more environmental and something spiritual. So lots of Green Man type festivals. And of course, you have your amazing Scottish Beltane and other celebrations in Scotland as well. So more and more people are being drawn to those things. And I think what we're seeing now in the kind of multicultural societies that we live in, where, if you like, every religion is available, and there's a kind of marketplace out there of competing religions, really. So what's sort of happening is that people are aware of all these different faith traditions. People's family backgrounds are often very mixed with different faith traditions. So it's like all these different religions and traditions are mixing in our psyches, they're mixing in our gene pools. And at the same time, people are drawing on all those, but at the same time feel perhaps a need for something much simpler. They're not really looking for religions based on books or in buildings or in beliefs in what men long dead have told them is so. So there's a deep felt need for a simpler nature-based spirituality, a need to reconnect with something that we can all share. And it's that kind of spiritual hunger, I think, that's prompted my most recent book, which is called Wild Once. Apologies, I can't show this to you properly because I can't mirror image this camera, but it's Wild Once, but sort of reversed. Okay, so that's the kind of cover it is. And what that book's about is that it's drawing really on my whole adult life. Well, actually, my life since I was born, because I talk about childhood as well. Because I think for many of us, our childhood is the beginning of our paganism, although we may not have that label at that point. But as many of you will know, I've spent all my adult life, from my late teens, immersed in Wicca and Kabbalah and other forms of paganism, and in the more spiritually oriented psychologies, such as the work of Jung. And what I'm trying to do in Wild Once is a bit similar to what I was trying to do in my Wicca book, but talking more generally about a nature-based spirituality. And as with my book Wicca, Wild Once is not a how-to book, it's more a how it is book. So in essence, what I'm doing is extracting the important building blocks and key themes of a pagan spirituality and writing about what it's like to integrate and prioritize these in one's worldview and bring them into our lives, and how it affects the world and the way we see it. And when I was writing the book, I had two audiences in mind. One is that the audience who, like many of you who will be listening here, people who are experienced practitioners of paganism, Wicca, magic, spiritual psychology. And what I hope you will find is that the ideas and experiences I describe in Wild Once resonate with you and help you reflect on your own path and where it is taking you. And the second readership is likely to be those people who are ticking the no religion box on the census form, or possibly Buddhist or spiritualist. But I'm thinking of people who have developed their own worldview and spirituality and feel the need for something that's nature oriented to add to that. And they may have no personal experience of paganism or of magic or of Wicca or anything like that, but will probably have heard of these things and be curious about them and wonder what these traditions and practices might have to offer. And what I hope that Wild Once can convey is something about how what can start off as doing love spells in your teenage bedroom can become a profound philosophy of life that is feminist and environmentalist and is realistic about humankind, but still hopeful that we can transform ourselves and our world into a better place. And I think it's very significant and also an indication of the wide appeal of a nature-based spirituality that Wild Once was published or is published by a mainstream publisher. So the first publishers of my book Wicca were Aquarian Press, a very old esoteric press, but a niche esoteric publisher. They published Gerald Gardner. And then they were eventually bought out by HarperCollins. But Wild Once has been published by Penguin, so a very mainstream publisher. And I didn't approach Penguin to write a book, they approached me. And they approached me because they wanted a book that would address the kind of issues that I write about. So what we are seeing is that ideas that many of us have had for decades, and maybe for many of us, we might have had times when we felt ourselves just to be lone voices in the wilderness, as it were. Well, those ideas are entering the mainstream. And as another sign of that, this month I did something I had never done before, which is to write an article for Vogue. So that's the fashion magazine, Vogue. So very mainstream. And it had this picture in it of this lady dressed in kind of spring colours. And what that article is about how to celebrate spring equinox. And again, that came sort of from Vogue. So what they were looking for was not rituals, but simple things that readers could do at home to mark the season's change. And what we're seeing with this, I think, is a kind of secular paganism. So people want to do things like go out into nature and mindfully walk and really look and see what's happening around them, and to listen to the bird song, to feel the earth, to feel the bark of a tree, to appreciate with all their senses the natural world, but also want to sanctify their own homes as well. So I talk about setting up a small, I'm not sure if I use the word altar, but kind of altar, shrine, a sacred spot in your home to honor the season. So bringing seasonal items to that. I talk about creating a special spring festival meal using seasonal foods and foraging for seasonal ingredients, and having a kind of celebration of the season together with family and friends. And I also talk about doing simple candle magic and tuning into the tide of change and the energy of Aries at this time. And if you're a pagan, you might think, well, that's all very pagan, but the people who are doing it wouldn't necessarily even know that word or label themselves as pagan, but they are the kind of, or the very people who might eventually decide if they want to get married to look for a hand fasting in a stone circle rather than getting married in a church or a registry office. And that this kind of outer group of people, people who are interested in nature spirituality, sanctifying things and rituals perhaps in their home, but don't necessarily want to label themselves with any particular brand of spiritual tradition or path. There are millions of people like that out there, and I think as organized religion in many sectors of society is in decline, this informal, individualized, at-home, nature-based spirituality will grow. So how does that affect us, we who are, if you like, the core of the pagan community? Well, I'm not sure all these people are going to be increasing pagan numbers on the census. I think these will be the people ticking the no religion box and then coming to a pagan for a pagan hand fasting. So what's kind of happening, whether we intended it or not, is that we who are at the core of the tradition are in the position of, I would say, keeping alive and feeding the flame of ancient and evolving traditions and practices and beliefs, so that others may come and warm themselves by that fire. And the core of committed pagans who label themselves pagan is still small, but there are many, many more people who are drawn to that spirituality that we've all been nurturing over the past decades and finding a source of spiritual nourishment and strength in it. So it's at that stage where I'm writing Wild Once, both for those within the type of spiritualities that we practice and for those who are interested in them. And I'll just say something briefly now about some of the themes I explore in the book. So if I just pick on three, nature, another is intuition, and the third is something about the challenges of living now in this difficult time. So a major theme of the book is nature spirituality and the importance of our connection to nature. And this was something for me, and I guess for many of you who are listening, something I experienced throughout my childhood, and it was the beginning of my journey into paganism. And it was only really when I moved to London that I realised just how connected I had been to the natural world around me, and I mean on a deep spiritual and psychological level. And how disrupted I felt when this connection was severed. I really felt like a plant that's sort of been pulled up by the roots and stuck in a pot. And if you live in a city, you may have noticed that at times you might have an intense craving, a kind of thirst for greenness, for flowers and grass and trees, especially after long hours indoors during winter. And scientists have now even created a name for this, nature deficit disorder. So we can suffer from nature deficit disorder. And many people are aware of this. And one of the things that happened with lockdown because of COVID was obviously vast numbers of people had to work at home. So they were in their homes rather than in their offices, and they weren't spending so much time traveling to work. So they actually had more time to go outside. So I think people became more aware of the need to be in a natural setting during COVID. And just to go and walk mindfully in nature. And as soon as we go into nature, our perspective changes. So as a psychologist, I know that greenness and nature are incredibly psychologically and spiritually nourishing for people. So the thoughts, the emotions, anxieties, fears, all this negative stuff that can preoccupy us can just dissolve when we see the beauty of a sunrise or a sunset, or we look at the flight of a flock of birds, or the beauty of a flower, or we hear the sea, we look at the vastness of the sky. And we as a species are deeply moved by nature. We find the sacred in nature because I think our deeper self is an ecological self that feels deeply connected with other species and with the natural world around us. But the complex civilizations we've created have taken us further and further away from that. So there's a deep inner need within many of us, I think, to reconnect with that natural world, and to go into that deeper place within us, that place of stillness where we feel that connection. When we're in a meditative state, we can sense the energies of trees and flower and earth so much more strongly. And I think many of us, pagan or non-pagan, are now very attracted to go out and do meditative periods and times and walks in silence within nature, so we can sense that inner part of us that's deeply connected with what's around us. And when I talk about the inner, that takes us into our inner world. And I think for me, a very important part of any pagan tradition is encouraging people to turn inwards and to connect with their own power of intuition, their own inner voice, that inner voice of guidance, because we're not encouraging people to find external gurus and teachers and authorities. We're encouraging people to be their own inner guru, their own inner authority. But to do that, we have to kind of get rid of all the busyness in the head so we can hear the deep wisdom of the deeper self within. And I think our pagan practices can help us with that. So pagan spirituality for me speaks through song and poetry and creative ritual expression. So it's born in the heart and not the head. It's born from traditions that were oral much more than they were ever dependent on written text, although written text can be very beautiful and important too. And I think above all, for me, a pagan spirituality is born from an empathy with the natural world and also an empathy with our own inner world, with the world of dream and vision and symbol. And all of these things come from much older parts of the brain. They are those parts of our brain that led our species to paint and draw long before we ever invented written language, maybe even earlier than we ever developed an extensive language at all. So the visual imagery and symbolism of paganism and its traditions are very powerful. And working with all of this, and with meditative and ritual practices that encourage silence and coming together with others and sharing of consciousness with others. They enhance our imagination, our intuition, as I said, and our empathy. And they create a deep sense of connection between our individual core selves and those of other human beings, but also those non-human others and those processes that together create our biosphere. So what our paganism can do is awaken our natural feelings towards nature and the planet we live on, and beyond that, the universe around us. And when we contemplate these things, when we look out into the starry heavens at night, the kind of feelings that come to us if we listen to our inner response, if we are quiet and notice our feelings and the images that come to us, they're feelings of wonder and gratitude and love. And I think pagan spirituality can remind us and bring us to all those states of being, and to trust that inner voice within us that's connected to the deeper and wiser and older divine spark that's within each one of us. That is, if you like, our inner guiding star. And when we talk about that aspect of pagan spirituality, it overlaps very much with what the more spiritually oriented psychologies are endeavouring to do, which is to help people grow in consciousness and to become more open and connected with one another. And I always talk about this sort of core self, you might call it the true self, if that's part of your practice. I tend to call it the deeper rather than the higher self, because I think when we connect with these older and deeper aspects of our being, we come very close, not only to our more spiritual self, but also our more animal self. And that's a very interesting paradox, I think. So all this head stuff takes us away both from our true spirit and the energy and the wisdom of the body. And paganism is a very embodied practice if you think about it. So ritual is almost like a kind of mandala of movement. It creates archetypal patterns and we experience them with the body. It can be a very sensate practice with the use of incense and beautiful artifacts. So it awakens with us our sense of beauty, our visual sense, our bodily sense, our deeper, more naturalistic sense, the pre-sense to the literate world, if you like, and also that core part of us, that inner wisdom that is the divine spark within us. And as we go deeper into these paths, they can change the way we experience the world around us. They can become paths of self-transformation and paths of opening consciousness. And I think what we find, those of us who practice the more magical side of paganism, is that beyond simple spells, we discover that magic is less about achieving any material change directly than about something more subtle, which is about changing ourselves so we can change the world around us. And I think it's that type of magic that keeps people on a pagan path long, many decades, and long perhaps after interest in so much spell work has faded away. So we can find in paganism a nature mysticism that changes how we view the world, but that doesn't mean that we want to go off into some airy-fairy other world and ignore the everyday world and its problems. But what I think a rootedness in a nature-based spirituality and in these practices of meditation and ritual and other pagan practices can do is to give us an inner strength in order to deal with the world and all the challenges that the world faces. And one of the things that Wicca and other pagan and magical traditions too represent for me is a rejection of patriarchy. And I think this is an aspect of paganism that's very powerful and that draws people. For International Women's Day, I tweeted a quote from Charles Leyland's 1899 book, Aradia, the Gospel of the Witches, for those of you who know this book. It was one of, and if you don't, it was one of the texts that inspired the 20th century pagan witchcraft revival. Some of the words from Aradia were incorporated into the charge of the goddess. And while Charles Leyland, who was a very interesting man, fascinating man, was writing, he was ostensibly writing a book about ancient magical religion. But at the same time, there's a very strong political message in the book. The book talks about the goddess Aradia, and he depicts her as a savior goddess, and she's saving the people from the oppression of the rich and the powerful, and from the leaders of patriarchal religions. So the goddess is going to come and liberate everybody from all this. And there's a lovely passage in the book's appendix where he said that regardless of whether or not we believe in witchcraft or in magic, the witch symbolizes rebellion, a rebelliousness that's open to all women. And he's got this lovely phrase, for every woman is at heart a witch. So that was my phrase for International Women's Day. And I think for many of us, the witch is a powerful symbol because she is an assertion of individuality, empowerment, an overturning of societal norms that oppress women and men and those whose identities do not conform. For fundamental, I think, to all pagan thinking is the idea that we are sovereign, autonomous individuals with the right to own the whole of our being, body and spirit, and to discover who and what we truly are. And this is an ethos that rejects all that oppresses or enslaves others. It's an ethos that wants to create societies in which everyone can have the opportunity to live a fulfilling life and to meet the needs of the spirit as well as the body. And whether we want to be political or not, my feeling is that in our polarized world, these views are deeply political. So our pagan values are important now when we see what's happening in geopolitics as being very dangerous and very threatening. Because one of the things I feel is that intellectually, human beings, we have advanced, but in terms of emotional intelligence and maturity, we really are like toddlers. Our species is quite new, so there's room and time to grow up, but time is running out. And one of our problems is that our politics, a lot of it is all about me and mine. So we have political slogans like America first, Britain first. In other words, I will privilege myself and those like me and forget that I live on a planet, small round thing, very small. And so that kind of nationalism and me firstism is deeply dysfunctional, and its thinking is deeply flawed. And we could think of the flaws in that thought process as being something we could explain in economic terms or in political terms. We could turn to social science. But there is another way of looking at it, which is to say that it's flawed on a much deeper level because it fails to understand the true nature of reality. And the truth about biological life forms, including ourselves, human beings, is not separation and isolation, but symbiosis, interconnectivity, and mutual dependence. And until our thinking can become global, because nature takes no notice of national boundaries, nor do pandemics or tornadoes or floods, then the real problems of our planet cannot be solved. We need to find worldviews and philosophies that encourage us to see ourselves as parts of an interconnected whole. So the vision that pagans often talk about of a web of us all being part of a web of interconnected energies is, I think, the true reality of our planet. And it's one that we need to, as much as we can, try and communicate to others. And I've tried a little bit in my book World Once. And we need to hold on to our vision and our values, because there are tyrants out there who threaten the freedom of nations. There are political dictators who kind of try to put a veer of legality and respectability around their horrendous world domination visions. We have corporate empires who have bigger economies than that of a sovereign state. So there are those who are not working towards the global good and do intend to carry on doing that in their me first way. So those of us who think there is something wrong with that, we need the strength to refuse to become like them, to hold on to our values, and to continually speak of the worth of all humankind and of the values that connect us and create unity and not separation, and that involve collective responsibility and not giving over our power to others. And these are the values that can inspire us to dance for our gods and our goddesses, and to create spiritual practices and teachings of love and compassion and joy. And we can choose, while holding on to those values and being inspired by what we find in nature, not to acquiesce to those who would have power over us. We can choose to resist. And we can choose to hold on to our creative vision of an interconnected world in which human beings recognize that at a deeper level of consciousness, we are not individual and alone, we are one. And we recognize that a pagan-based spirituality is not for everyone. But some of the essence of it is. So practices of seasonal observance and simple ceremonies to honour the human life cycle, the things that encourage a veneration for life itself, for the gift of consciousness, the amazing privilege of being born into this wondrous universe of ours. All these things are things that we can talk about to others, that we can encourage others to practice, not necessarily labeling themselves pagan at all, but that can help bring people to a shift in consciousness. And I think above all, for me, the message of paganism is that we live in an amazing and beautiful and interconnected universe, which we must do everything we can to preserve and maintain and sustain. And that knowing that within us, we can live lives as journeys of joyful discovery that honours all that is good and whole and true in the human spirit, and seeks to manifest it in ourselves and in the world. So however dark the world may get, we always remember that the sun rises, the stars shine, the beauty and the synergy and the connectivity are there, and we will strive to keep that so. So I would say to those of us who are at the committed core of pagan spirituality, let's keep that sacred fire burning. Let's feed it with our vision and our creative imagination and our deeds and our words, so that others may come and find warmth and light there, because our world will need this if we are to address the challenges that are to come. So thank you for listening, and I look forward, if the gods permit, to joining you at the next major anniversary of the Scottish Pagan Federation. Goodbye.